The hall went quiet when I chose, and then, 3 seconds later, 400 people started laughing. I want you to understand that I heard all of it. People assume that in a moment like that the sound blurs, that shock protects you. It does not. I heard individual voices. I heard a man near the front say, "He's joking," to the woman beside him, and I heard her say, "He isn't." And I heard someone behind me laugh so hard he had to stop and catch his breath. And I heard my brother, standing 8 feet to my left, say my name, Ezra, in the voice you use for a child who has just walked into a glass door. I was 22 years old. My father had been dead for 4 months, and I had just chosen, in front of the entire city, the single most useless system ever recorded. Let me back up, but only a little, because the choosing is where this starts and everything before it is only the reason. My name is Ezra Vane. My father built Vane and Sons Ironworks with his own hands over 34 years, a foundry and fabrication shop down by the river that made stair rails and gates and structural steel for half the buildings in the old quarter. He employed 91 people. He knew every one of their names and their wives' names and which of their children were struggling at school. He died owing $412,000. Not from failure, from decency. He had carried 3 clients through a bad winter rather than let their sites shut down and their crews go unpaid. 2 of those clients recovered and paid him back. The 3rd went under and took my father's margins with it, and my father, being my father, never chased the debt, because the man who owed it had 4 children and my father could not make himself do it. So when he died, we inherited a foundry worth something, a debt worth more, and 91 people whose livelihoods depended on 2 brothers who had never run anything. Silas was 2 years older than me. He is the most naturally gifted person I have ever met, and I say that without bitterness, because it is simply true and it is the engine of everything that happened. He could walk into a room of strangers and own it in 4 minutes. He could look at a problem and see the shortest line through it while everyone else was still reading the question. He also could not, under any circumstance, wait for anything. Not a meal, not a train, not a payoff. If a thing could not be had today, Silas experienced its absence as an insult. And on the day of the awakening, that difference between us stopped being a personality trait and became the whole of both our lives. The awakening happens once, at 22, for everyone. You stand in the vault hall beneath the old exchange building in front of the ledger. A thing the size of a house that nobody has ever satisfactorily explained, made of some black material that swallows light, and it offers you a choice of 2 systems. 2 only. Nobody knows how it picks them. They are always different, always tailored, and always one of them looks obviously better than the other. That is the part people forget. The ledger does not offer you 2 good options. It offers you a bright one and a dull one, and the entire city has spent 200 years arguing about whether that is a test or a joke. Silas went first because Silas always went first. The ledger showed his 2 in the air above him, in that pale silver script everyone in the hall can read. The immediate system. All value generated is returned at once, in full at the moment of generation. No delay. No conditions. The deferral system. All value deposited is locked for a term of the holder's choosing. Return scale with the length of the term. Even reading it now, I understand why the hall reacted the way it did. Immediate is not a subtle system. It means that every deal you close pays instantly. Every hour of work converts to reward the second it is finished. It is the removal of every gap between effort and reward that has ever existed in human life. Silas didn't even wait for the second line to finish rendering. Immediate, he said. Confirm. The hall made a sound like a wave. It was, everyone agreed, one of the best draws in a decade. My brother turned around and found me in the crowd and grinned at me, and I want to be honest, I was happy for him. In that specific moment, before any of the rest of it, I was genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy for my brother. Then I stepped up, and the ledger offered me the exact same too. That does not happen. Systems are not repeated within a family, or within a day, or, as far as anyone in that hall had ever heard, at all. The 2 awakening officials at the base of the ledger actually stopped what they were doing and looked at each other. The immediate system. All value generated is returned at once, in full at the moment of generation. The deferral system. All value deposited is locked for a term of the holder's choosing. Return scale with the length of the term. And underneath, for me only, in smaller script that nobody else in that hall could see, one additional line the ledger had not shown my brother. Terms available: 1 year to 50 years. Return multiplier scales geometrically. I have thought about that hidden line every day for 18 years, and I still do not know whether the ledger was helping me or testing me. I only know what it told me, which was that this was not a choice between a good system and a bad one. It was a choice between a system that gave you everything now, and a system that gave you an unimaginable amount later, and made you survive the gap. I did the arithmetic standing there. Geometric scaling across a 50-year range is not a small thing. If 1 year returned double and the curve was even modestly geometric, then 10 years was not 10 times better. It was orders of magnitude better. And 50 years was a number I could not hold in my head. But between here and there was a desert, and I would have to walk across it with nothing in front of everyone, for as long as it took. I thought about my father. 34 years of stair rails. 91 people. $412,000 of debt he took on because a man with 4 children asked him for time. Deferral, I said. Confirm. And the hall laughed. Silas found me outside on the steps 20 minutes later, and he was not laughing. He was worse than laughing. He was kind. Okay, he said. Both hands up. Okay, it's fine. We'll figure it out. He put an arm around my shoulders, the way he had when I was 9 and had lost a race I'd been sure I would win. You panicked. It happens. Half the people in there would have panicked. I didn't panic. Ezra. He laughed then, but gently, which was somehow much worse. You had the same too. The exact same too. Do you understand how that's actually kind of a miracle? The ledger gave you a free copy of the best draw of the decade and you. He stopped himself and reset and smiled. It doesn't matter. Look, I'll carry us. That's what this means. You'll work the floor, I'll handle the money, and in 2 years nobody will even remember today. I have replayed that conversation a great many times. I want to be fair to him because fairness is the only thing that makes the rest of it comprehensible. He meant it. On that step, on that afternoon, my brother genuinely intended to carry me for the rest of our lives, and he was proud of himself for it, and there was real love in it. The problem is that a man who has decided to carry you has also decided that you cannot walk. The first year was the worst year of my life, and I include in that comparison the years that came later, which were objectively far more dangerous. Here is what the deferral system actually felt like in practice. I would properly work 12 and 14-hour days on the Foundry floor, doing the physical labor of the business while Silas took meetings. At the end of a job, the system would open in the corner of my vision, plain gray script on nothing. Value generated, $840. Deposit, select term. And I would select a term and the money would go away. Not into a bank. Away. Locked. Held. Invisible, unreachable. The system did not let you view a balance. There was no running total, no progress bar, no reassurance of any kind. There was only the deposit, the term, and then silence for 1 year or 3 or 10, however long you had chosen. Meanwhile, for feet away, my brother would close a contract and watch the full value of it land in his account before the client had finished shaking his hand. I lived that first year on almost nothing. I put every dollar I generated into the system because the entire logic of the thing was that partial commitment produced partial results, and partial results were not going to clear $412,000 of my father's debt. I ate at the Foundry. I slept in the office above it for 8 months because I had let my apartment go. I wore my father's old work coat because it was there and it was free. The men on the floor thought I was noble. That was almost unbearable. Old Theodore Marsh, who had run the poor line for 26 years and who had taught me to weld when I was 14, took me aside in the 4th month and tried to give me money out of his own wages, and I had to invent a lie about a savings account to make him stop. There was a night in the 2nd year that I have never told anyone about. Our mother's 60th birthday. 40 people in a function room, most of them family, all of them aware of what had happened in the vault hall. I had generated $1,100 that week and deposited every cent of it that morning on a 5-year term, which meant I arrived at my mother's 60th with $14 in my pocket and a present I had made myself in the workshop. A steel rose, cold-forged, the kind of thing my father used to make for her. Silas gave her a car. I want to be fair. It was a good car and she needed one and he did it out of love. But I stood in that room holding a piece of steel I had spent 9 hours on, and I watched 40 people watch my brother hand our mother a set of keys, and then I watched every one of them arrange their faces before they turned to look at what I had brought. My aunt said, "Oh, Ezra, that's so thoughtful." She meant it kindly. That was the worst part. Every single person in that room was being kind to me carefully, the way you are kind to someone who is not doing well. My mother kept the rose on her kitchen windowsill until she died. The car was sold 4 years later to cover something of Silas's. I did not know that at the time, and when I found out I did not tell her. Silas, in that same year, bought a car for himself, then a better one. Moved into the Tower District. Started wearing suits that cost more than a poor-line worker made in a month. And to be fair, he also worked. He was extraordinary. He brought in 11 new clients in that first year, more than my father had landed in the previous 5, because he could walk into any room and make people believe him. Vane and Sons doubled its order book. From the outside, we looked like a triumph. The golden brother and the loyal one, rebuilding their father's company. The debt came down. That was real, and it was mostly him, and I have never pretended otherwise. What nobody outside the two of us could see was the arithmetic underneath. Because Silas's system returned value at the moment of generation, which meant that the reward arrived attached to the deal, not to the business. The money landed in his hands, personally, instantly. And a man receiving instant personal reward for every closed deal is a man who will, without ever deciding to, start optimizing for closed deals rather than for good ones. Started small. A contract priced slightly under what the job actually cost to run, because the system paid him on signature and the loss showed up 11 weeks later on the Foundry's books, which were my problem. A promise to a client about a delivery date that the floor could not physically meet, because the promise closed the deal and the missed date was a conversation for future Silas. I raised it the first time in month 9. I remember it exactly because it was the first genuine argument we ever had as adults. The Halloran job is underpriced by $19,000, I said. I ran it 3 times. It's a foot in the door. It's a foot in the door that costs us $19,000. It costs the company $19,000, he said. And it brings the company a client that's worth $200 over 5 years. He said it patiently, like he was explaining whether you're looking at one job. I'm looking at the relationship. I'm looking at the fact that you got paid on it and we didn't. I should not have said it that way. He went very still, and something behind his face closed like a door, and he said, "That's the system, Ezra. That's not me. You had the chance to have the same one." And there it was. There it was in month 9, the shape of everything that came after, sitting in the middle of the room between us where neither of us wanted to look at it. Every disagreement we would ever have from that day forward would end in the same place. You chose this. Whatever I did was a choice I had made. Whatever he did was simply the nature of the world. I stopped raising it after that. Not because I stopped seeing it, but because I understood, in a way I could not have articulated at 23, that I had no standing. I was a man with no money, no visible results, and an obviously inferior system, telling the golden brother he was doing it wrong. So instead I did the only thing I could actually do. I started keeping a second set of books. Not falsified, the opposite. Accurate ones. The company books recorded what Silas booked. My books recorded what the jobs actually cost. Real material, real hours, real rework, real overtime to hit dates that had been promised without consulting the floor. Every underpriced contract, every missed date, every quiet write-off. I did it in a hardbound ledger, by hand, in pencil, at night, in the office above the Foundry. I told myself it was so that I could argue properly one day, when I had standing. That was not why I did it. I understand that now. I did it because some part of me that I was not being honest with had already started keeping a record. The first maturity came in the 14th month. I had almost forgotten it. That is the strangest thing about the deferral system. The deposits vanish so completely that they stop feeling real. 14 months earlier I had put in $840 on a 1-year term, mostly as a test, to see whether the thing worked at all. I was on the floor, in the middle of a pour, when the gray script opened. Term complete. Deposit $840. Term 1 year. Return $2,520. 3 times. Not 2. I stood there in the heat with a ladle in my hands and did the arithmetic I had been carrying around in my head for over a year, and I felt the floor tilt. Because if 1 year was 3 times, and the scaling was geometric, then the curve was much steeper than I had modeled. Over the following weeks I tested it properly with small amounts on different terms, and by the end of that year I had the shape of it. 1 year returned 3 times. 3 years returned roughly 11. 5 years about 30. 10 years, and I only had one small early data point to extrapolate from, but the curve was brutally consistent, was somewhere in the region of 200 times. 200. I sat with that number for a long time in an empty office above a foundry, and I understood 2 things at once. The first was that I was going to be, eventually, extraordinarily wealthy. The second was that, eventually, was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and that between now and eventually there were years in which I would look exactly as useless as everyone already believed I was, and that my brother, with a system that rewarded him instantly and constantly, was going to spend those same years becoming a man who could not imagine ever being wrong. That was the moment I made the decision that shaped the next decade. I decided not to tell him. I have been asked about that a great deal, and I want to answer it honestly rather than flatteringly. The generous version is that I knew what he would do with the information. A man with an immediate system, told that his brother's deposits would return 200-fold in 10 years, does not become patient. He becomes a man who wants access to those deposits. He would have pushed for us to pool, to formalize, to put my system's output under company control, and it would have sounded reasonable, and it would have ended with me generating value and him receiving it. That version is true. But the whole truth includes something less noble, which is that after 14 months of being laughed at, I wanted him to be wrong. I wanted the number to arrive on its own, someday with no explanation and no warning, and I wanted to watch his face. That want cost me 8 years I will never get back. I'll come to that. So I said nothing, and I went to work, and I began doing the only genuinely clever thing I have ever done in my life. I started laddering. If you know anything about how a serious person handles long-dated instruments, you already understand the idea. You do not put everything on one term. You build a ladder, some money on 1-year terms, some on 3, some on 5, some on 10. The short terms mature continuously and keep you alive. The long terms sit in the dark, untouched, compounding towards something enormous. So that is what I did every week, for years. Roughly half of everything I generated went onto short terms, to fund the next stretch of my life. The rest went long 5 years, 10 years, and, starting in my 4th year, a handful of deposits on the longest terms I dared, when I had something substantial to place. And because I could not appear wealthy, because the entire strategy depended on nobody, especially Silas, understanding what was accumulating, I lived publicly exactly as I had before. Same coat, same office above the foundry, even after I could have afforded better. Same 12-hour days on the floor. To every single person in that company, and to my brother above all, I was the loyal, plodding, unlucky Vane brother who had made a catastrophic choice at 22 and was quietly serving out the sentence. The short-term maturities went into 2 things, and only 2. The first was the debt. Quietly, through the company's accounts, structured so it looked like the foundry's own operating performance. By the end of year 4, my father's $412,000 was gone. Silas took the credit for that publicly at a dinner in a speech, and I sat there and applauded with everyone else. The second was people. That one requires explanation because it turned out to matter more than anything else I did. Every time a maturity came in that I could spare, I put it into the 91. Not as charity, that would have been noticed and refused. As infrastructure. New poor-line equipment when the old rig started failing. Proper safety gear. A genuine apprenticeship program for the sons and daughters of the floor workers, run out of the back building, which I paid for personally and attributed to a trust from your father's estate. A lie I told for 11 years and would tell again. Theodore Marsh's grandson came through that program. So did the 2 Oquosa boys. So did 19 others. I taught on it myself 2 evenings a week, for 9 years. That was not strategy either. It was that I had nothing else to do with my evenings, because I had no money to spend and no social life to speak of, and a workshop full of 17-year-olds who wanted to learn to weld was better company than a rented room. I was good at it, which surprised me. My father had taught me by standing behind me and saying almost nothing until I got it wrong, and I found I could not teach that way, so I taught the way I thought instead, slowly from first principles with the arithmetic written out. There is a young man called Dima Okwosa who runs the poor line at the Foundry now. He came into that program at 16, and he was the worst apprentice I ever had for about 5 months, and then something clicked and he became the best. He is 29 now. He has 2 children. He does not know that the trust that paid for his training was a man in a borrowed coat putting maturity payments into an envelope. I am not going to tell him. It would change how he speaks to me, and I like how he speaks to me. None of them knew where it came from. All of them knew, in the vague way that workforces know things, that the loyal brother spent all his time on the floor and the golden brother spent all his time in the Tower District. That distinction was going to matter enormously, and I did not build it deliberately. I want to be clear about that. I built it because I liked those men and because my father would have done the same. The fact that it later became the single strongest asset I owned is something I did not plan and do not deserve credit for. Year 6 is when it turned. Silas had, by then, outgrown Vane and Sons. That was inevitable. A man who receives full value instantly does not remain patient with a foundry's margins. He had started acquiring a haulage firm, then a fabrication yard upriver, then a controlling interest in a coatings plant. He rolled them all, along with Vane and Sons, into a holding company he named Vane Industrial, and he was very good at it, and by year 6 he was one of the 20 most talked about businessmen in the city. He was also, by then, carrying an amount of debt that I found genuinely frightening. I want to be careful here because this is the part that people get wrong when they retell it. My brother was not stupid. He was not even, at that stage, dishonest. He was doing something perfectly rational for a man with his particular system. He was borrowing against future deals because for him the gap between a deal and its reward was 0, and a man who has never experienced a gap stops believing gaps exist. He would sign a contract, receive its full value instantly and personally, and then borrow against the expected performance of the underlying business to fund the next acquisition. The personal reward was real. The business performance behind it was increasingly not. By year 6, the gap between what Vane Industrial appeared to be and what it actually was had become a canyon, and I was the only person on earth standing at the bottom of it with a hardbound ledger and a pencil. I tried one more time. I want that on the record because of what came after. I asked him to dinner, not at the Foundry, not at his office, neutral ground, and I brought 6 years of real numbers and I laid them out. He looked at them for a long time, longer than I expected. And then he said something I have never forgotten. "You've been keeping these for 6 years." "Yes." "Not helping me. Keeping records on me." "Silas." "No, it's—" He held up a hand, and he was smiling, and his eyes were absolutely flat. "It's actually impressive. I mean that. 6 years of watching me and writing it down." He closed the ledger and slid it back across the table. "Do you know what I've been doing for 6 years? Ezra? Feeding you. Feeding 91 people. Paying off a debt you couldn't have touched. And building something Dad couldn't have imagined. While you welded rails and made notes on me in a book. The debt was—" And I stopped. I stopped because finishing that sentence meant explaining the deferral system, the ladder, the 200-fold curve, and the 6 years of long-dated deposits sitting in the dark. And in the half-second I had to decide, I looked at my brother's flat eyes across that table and I understood, with total clarity, that if I told him the truth right now he would not hear a warning. He would hear an asset. So I said, "The debt was Dad's. That's all." And he nodded and paid, and we did not speak properly again for 2 years. The betrayal, when it came, was not dramatic. I think people expect these things to be dramatic. It was a Tuesday and it was paperwork and it took 11 minutes. Silas had structured Vane Industrial with the original Foundry as a wholly owned subsidiary. That was fine and normal, and I had signed off on it years earlier, when signing off on things my brother put in front of me was simply what I did. What I had not understood, because I had not read it, because he was my brother, was that the subsidiary agreement gave the parent company the right to consolidate operations at its discretion. In year 8, Vane Industrial exercised that right. Vane and Sons Ironworks was consolidated into group operations. The Foundry site by the river, which my father had bought in 1974 and built with his own hands, was designated non-core and scheduled for sale to a developer. The 91, by then 106, were offered relocation to the fabrication yard upriver, 40 minutes away, at revised rates. And my role as the subsidiary's operations director was made redundant by the consolidation. He had me removed from the building by security. Not out of cruelty, I genuinely believe this, but because his lawyer told him it was cleaner, and because by then Silas had reached a place where cleaner was the only argument that reached him. Theodore Marsh, who was 68 years old and had worked that floor for 32 years, walked out with me. He did not say anything. He just put his coat on and walked out beside me, and 11 other men did the same, and I had to stand in the car park and tell them to go back inside, because they had families and I had nothing left to give them. That was the worst hour of my life. Not the laughing at the awakening. Not the 8 months sleeping in the office. That hour in the car park. Telling men who had known me since I was a child to go back in and work for my brother because I could not protect them. I was 30 years old. I had no job, no title, no company, and no visible money. What I had, and what my brother, in 11 minutes of paperwork, had not thought to ask about, was 8 years of long-dated deposits sitting in the dark, and a hard-bound ledger, and a name that 106 people trusted. I did not do anything for 4 months. I want to be honest about why, because it was not strategy. It was that I could not get up. For 4 months I sat in a rented room and did the thing you do, which is replay every conversation and find the place where you should have said something different. Month 9 of year 1, when I said, "You got paid on it and we didn't," and watched the door close behind his face. The dinner in year 6, when I had the ledger open on the table and chose, in half a second, to lie to him about the debt. The subsidiary agreement in year 4 that I signed without reading because he was my brother and reading it would have been an accusation. I found about 9 of those moments. I have found more since. That is what the 4 months were. And underneath all of it was a thing I could not look at directly, which was that I had a system that was going to make me one of the wealthiest men in the country, and it had not saved a single one of the 106 people I actually cared about, because I had spent 11 years being too proud to explain it to the one person who could have been warned. I had chosen the long game. And the long game had a cost, and the cost was not paid by me. It was paid by Theodore Marsh, who was 68, and by 105 other people who had never chosen anything at all. That is what I sat in that room with. Not grief. In voice. What got me up was Theodore. He turned up at that rented room in the 4th month with a bag of food he could not afford and sat in the only chair and told me, in about 6 sentences, what was happening at the yard upriver. That the relocation rates were lower than promised. That the safety gear I had put in had not been transferred. That 2 men had already left and 3 more were about to, and that the apprenticeship program had been quietly closed because the trust funding it had stopped. The trust funding it had stopped because I had stopped. Because I had been sitting in a room for 4 months. I got up. The first thing I did was the least dramatic and the most important. I went and got the truth. I could not access Vane Industrial's books anymore. But I did not need to because I had something better. I had 6 years of my own records, and I had 106 people who had worked every one of those jobs and who would talk to me. I did it the way my father would have done it, which is to say from the ground up with my hands, one piece at a time. Over the next 9 months I reconstructed Vane Industrial from the outside, not from its accounts, but from its physical reality. I met men in car parks and cafes and twice in a church hall. Not covertly. I simply asked, and they simply told me, because they had known me for a decade and my brother's name was no longer worth much on a shop floor. I built it job by job. What steel actually went out of the gate. How many hours the floor actually worked. What was reworked and rescheduled and quietly written off. Theodore kept a diary. He had kept one for 32 years, a line a day, weather and tonnage, and that diary turned out to be worth more than any document I ever obtained legally. Then I laid all of it against the public filings and against my own 6 years of baseline, and I did the arithmetic 3 times because I did not believe it the first 2. What was actually produced? What was actually delivered? What was actually paid for and what had quietly been written off? Theodore and the men gave me the floor-level truth of every contract. Public filings gave me what the company claimed, and my old ledger gave me 6 years of baseline showing exactly how the gap had opened and at what rate. and what emerged was worse than I had feared. By year 9, Vane Industrial was not a company that was struggling. It was a company that had become a mechanism for converting borrowed money into personal instant reward. Silas would acquire a business using debt secured against that business's projected performance. The acquisition itself, structured as a transaction, generated value, which his system paid him personally and instantly. Then the acquired business would underperform, because it had been bought at a price justified only by projections nobody could hit, and the shortfall would be covered by the next acquisition. Every deal paid him. Not one of them paid the company. He had built a machine that made him richer every time it made the thing he owned poorer. And because his system had removed every gap between action and reward, he had, I think genuinely, lost the ability to perceive that the two were different. I sat with the completed picture for a long time. Because here is the thing, I could have gone public with it. I had enough to seriously hurt him, enough to trigger an inquiry, spook his lenders, collapse the share price of the holding company. And 106 people worked inside that holding company. If Vane Industrial went down messily, Silas would lose a great deal of money, and every single one of those men would lose their job in a liquidation that paid creditors first and workers last. Theodore Marsh, at 74, would be looking for work in a city where nobody hires 69-year-old poor-line supervisors. So I could not break it. I had to catch it. And to catch something the size of Vane Industrial, I needed capital that could not be traced to Ezra Vane. In the 11th month of the 11th year, the first of the long deposits matured. I was in a rented room with a folding table and a hardbound ledger when the gray script opened. Term complete. Deposit, $61,400. Term, 10 years. Return, $12,894,000. 210 times. I sat there for a very long time. $12,894,000 from $61,000 I had deposited when I was 23 years old and sleeping in an office above a foundry because I could not afford an apartment. And behind it, still in the dark, still running. 7 more 10-year deposits, all larger, all placed in the years after I had understood the curve. And behind those, for deposits on terms I had not told anyone about, placed in years 5 through 8 on the longest terms I had ever dared. I did not celebrate. I want to be honest, I did not even feel triumphant. What I felt, sitting at that folding table, was something closer to vertigo, because I understood that the thing I had spent 11 years waiting for had arrived and I now had to be worthy of it. Then I got a pen and I started planning. The first thing I did with that money was not aimed at my brother at all. I bought the building. The Foundry site by the river, my father's site, the one designated non-core and scheduled for sale, was still on the market. The developer's option had lapsed because the redevelopment financing had gone sideways, which is the sort of thing that happens when the entire property market is slightly worse than everyone hoped. Vane Industrial still owned it and was still trying to unload it. So an entity called Marsh Riverside Holdings, a name I chose on purpose and which Theodore did not know about for another 2 years, bought a disused Foundry site from Vane Industrial for a fair price in cash with no conditions through a broker who never met the principal. Silas signed off on that sale personally. It generated value. His system paid him instantly, and I imagine he felt very good about it. He had just sold me our father's Foundry. Over the next 3 years, as the remaining 10-year deposits matured one after another, I did the same thing over and over, and I did it very quietly. I did not buy Vane Industrial shares. That would have been visible, and it would have driven the price up, and it would have alerted him. I bought its ground. I bought the freehold of the fabrication yard upriver, from the pension fund that owned it, and became my brother's landlord. I bought the coatings plant site the same way. I bought the 2 logistics depots that Vane Industrial's haulage division operated from, and the freehold under the head office in the Tower District. None of it was in my name. All of it was in Marsh Riverside Holdings, which was owned by a trust, which was administered by a firm in another city, and which appeared on every register as a perfectly ordinary, boring, patient property vehicle of the kind that owns half the commercial land in every city on earth. And I did one more thing, which was the part one am least comfortable with and which I would do again. I bought the debt. Not all of it. I could not have afforded all of it, even then. But when a lender wants out of a position quietly, they will sell it at a discount to a boring property vehicle that pays cash and asks no questions. Over 3 years, Marsh Riverside Holdings acquired roughly 40% of Vane Industrial's senior secured debt in 7 separate transactions from 4 different lenders who were all quietly relieved to be rid of it. By year 14, I owned the ground under my brother's entire operation and nearly half of what he owed. And he did not know my name was anywhere near it. I could have moved then. I want to be clear about that because the next part is the part 1 I'm asked about most. By year 14, I had enough to force the situation. As a major secured creditor and the freeholder of every operational site, I could have called defaults and taken the whole thing apart. I did not, for one reason. Doing it that way would still have destroyed 106 jobs. A forced liquidation is a forced liquidation regardless of who is holding the knife. I would have won, and Theodore Marsh would have been unemployed at 74, and I would have spent the rest of my life explaining to myself why that was acceptable. There was one other route, and it required something I did not yet have. If Silas were removed, not the company, him, the underlying businesses could survive. They were not worthless. The foundry was genuinely profitable. The coatings plant was fine. The yard was fine. What was killing Vane Industrial was not its operations but the machine sitting on top of them converting borrowed money into one man's instant personal reward. Cut off the machine and the body lives. But you cannot remove a founder chairman with a majority stake because you disapprove of his business model. You can only remove him if he does something that gives you the legal standing to do it. So I stopped building and I started waiting. Again. For the 4th time in my life I waited. Those 2 years were harder than the 11 that came before, and I did not expect that. The 11 years of the latter had been hard in a simple way. I was poor and people thought I was a fool, and I had to get up every morning and do it again. But there was work in it. There was a pour line at 6 in the morning and a ledger at night and 20 apprentices on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Waiting for a man to commit a crime is different. There is no work in it. There is only knowing. I knew by then roughly what was going to happen. I knew the shape of the hole he was carrying and the approximate date it would become visible, because I held his paper and I could read a covenant schedule. I knew that a man who had never once in his life experienced a gap between wanting and having would, when finally cornered by a calendar, do something that a patient man would not. And every week that I knew it and did nothing, I had to answer the question of whether I was still the person who had chosen deferral, or whether I had become something else that only looked like him. I asked Theodore about it once. Not directly. I could not tell him what I was doing. I asked him, in the abstract, whether a man was responsible for a thing he had made likely but had not made happen. He thought about it for about a minute, which is what he does, and then he said, "Depends whether you'd be sorry if he didn't." I sat with that for a long time. It is the sharpest thing anyone has ever said to me, because the honest answer was no. If Silas had looked at that contract and seen the milestone structure and gone to his board and said the hole is bigger than I've told you and I need help, I would have been glad.
Genuinely, unambiguously glad.
There was a version of those 2 years where my brother saved himself, and I had built the structure such that saving himself was entirely available to him, and I would have paid a great deal of money for that ending. He just never took it. Not once in 2 years and 7 months did the possibility appear to occur to him. Took 2 years and 7 months. In year 16, Vane Industrial needed a very large contract to cover a very large hole. Silas needed it in a way that a man like him should never need anything, and by then several people around him could smell it. I knew about the hole before he announced it, because I held his debt and debt holders receive information. I knew the size of it and the date it had to be covered by, and I knew that his acquisition machine had run out of road, because there was nothing left to buy that anyone would lend against. So Marsh Riverside Holdings, through an intermediary with no visible connection to me, arranged for a very large infrastructure contract to be brought to market. I want to be precise about what I did and did not do here because it matters. The contract was real. The money was real. The work was real and genuinely needed and, for years later, was genuinely completed by the yard upriver and is standing today. I did not invent a trap out of nothing and dangle it. I created a real opportunity at a real scale in a structure that a man running an honest business would have found perfectly ordinary, and that a man running Silas's machine would find irresistible for exactly the wrong reasons. The structure had staged milestone payments. That was the whole of it. Value released against certified completion of defined stages. For an honest operator, that is a normal, mildly annoying contract term. For a man whose system pays him personally and instantly on generated value, and who has a very large hole to fill by a very specific date, staged milestone certification is not a contract term. It is a temptation with a calendar attached. He took it. Of course he took it. And in the 4th month of that contract, with the whole 2 weeks from becoming visible to his lenders, my brother certified completion of a milestone that had not been completed. He did it himself, personally, with his own credentials from his own office on a Thursday afternoon. It was, in the scheme of what he had spent 16 years doing, almost a small thing. $11.4 million released against work that was, at that point, about 60% done. He fully intended to finish it. He said so later repeatedly, and I believe him. In his own mind, he was not stealing. He was borrowing 3 weeks from the future, which is a thing he had been doing his entire adult life without consequence. But a false certification against a staged infrastructure contract is not an accounting judgment. It is a criminal act, and it is a criminal act that leaves a perfect, dated, credentialed record. I did not go to the police with it because I did not need to and because I did not want it to be mine. The contract had an independent certifying engineer. That is standard. It is standard because contracts of that size always have one, and I had insisted on nothing unusual, only that the certifier be genuinely independent, which is what a certifier is supposed to be. The certifier found the discrepancy in the ordinary course of doing his job 11 days later, because that is what certifiers do. He reported it to the contracting authority, because that is what he is legally required to do. The contracting authority referred it because that is what they are legally required to do. I did nothing. I want that understood. From the moment the contract was signed, I did not touch it. I built a structure in which an honest man doing his ordinary job would inevitably discover what my brother had done, and then I stood entirely outside it and let ordinary men do their ordinary jobs. That is the whole trick. There is nothing clever in it beyond patience. People want there to be more. When I have described this to people since, I can see them waiting for the clever part, the forged document, the planted witness, the moment where I outwitted him. And there isn't one, and the absence of one seems to disappoint them. But that is precisely the point, and it took me 16 years to understand it. My brother was faster than me, sharper than me, and better with people than I will ever be. In any contest that could be decided inside a week, he would have destroyed me every single time, for the rest of our lives. So I did not compete inside a week. I competed inside 16 years, which was the one arena where his gifts were worth nothing and mine were worth everything. That is not cleverness. That is just knowing which race you can actually win, and then having the stomach to run it while people laugh. They arrested him on a Wednesday morning in the head office in the Tower District, on a floor of a building whose freehold I owned, though nobody in that room knew it. I was not there. I have been asked about that more than anything else. Whether I regret not being there. Whether I wish I had been in the room. For 16 years I had imagined a version of that room. I had rehearsed it. In the bad years, in the rented room, in the 4 months when I could not get up, I had a whole script for what I would say to my brother when he finally understood. And when the morning actually came, I was standing on the floor of my father's foundry, in my father's coat, watching a pour, because Marsh Riverside Holdings had reopened it 18 months earlier and 41 people worked there again. Theodore Marsh came and found me, because someone had called someone. He stood next to me for a while without saying anything. Then he said, "You knew this was coming." "Yes." "How long?" I thought about how to answer that honestly, and in the end I said, "About 16 years. He nodded slowly, and looked out at the pour and said, "Your father used to say the only thing worth having is the thing that's still there in the morning." I had never heard that before. I have thought about it every day since. The unwinding took 14 months, and it was the most complicated work I have ever done. Silas was removed as chairman within a week of the arrest. Not by me, by his own board, who had been looking for a reason for 2 years and now had an unarguable one. The company went into a standstill agreement with its creditors, of whom Marsh Riverside Holdings was, by a considerable margin, the largest. And that is where I finally stopped hiding. I want to describe that meeting, because it is the only moment in this entire story that felt the way I had imagined it would feel, and it did not feel good. It was a creditors' meeting on the 40th floor. 19 people around a table. The company's advisors on one side, the lenders on the other, and a chair at the head for the largest secured creditor, who had never once attended in person and had always been represented by a firm from another city. I came in wearing my father's coat, because I own better coats now and I did not want to be wearing one. I watched 11 people work out who I was in real time. That was a strange thing to watch. Some of them had known me at 22. One of them had been in the vault hall on the day I chose. And I put a proposal on the table. Marsh Riverside Holdings would convert its entire debt position to equity, inject new capital, and take control of Vane Industrial. Every operating business would be retained. Every site would remain in operation, which I could guarantee because I owned the ground under all of them and could simply say so. Every employee would keep their job at existing rates, and the relocated men from the Foundry consolidation would be offered their old roles back at the original site, which had been reopened. Every other creditor would be paid in full, 100 cents. And the holding company's equity, my brother's stake, and the stakes of the 4 investors who had backed his acquisition machine, would be written down to reflect what it was actually worth, which after 16 years of converting borrowed money into personal reward was almost exactly nothing. Nobody argued. There was nothing to argue with. It was a better outcome than any of them had modeled, and it was better because I did not need to extract anything from it. I had been paid, in full, by a system that had spent 16 years quietly compounding in the dark while everyone looked the other way. That is